Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface, where we look at social, political and Islamic affairs taking place around the world. Today we'll be discussing the Middle East conflict. What can we do through interfaith dialogue to make a difference? Joining us on this show is the Vicar of Christ Church, Dr Stephen Seizer. Thank you very much for being with us today. Firstly, I'd like to ask what's taking place in the Middle East?
Well, we're seeing the continued involvement of the major colonial powers, if you like, Russia, the United States and European powers continuing to interfere either to protect their interests in oil or their association with Israel. In particular, the United States' involvement in the Middle East seems to be largely driven by an Israeli agenda.
Why is that though?
Well, the Zionist movement has historically been birthed, if you like, in Britain and the United States. Christians in the United States and in Britain in particular in the 19th century were very influential in assisting the Zionists, people like Theodor Herzl and others, to refine and make concrete their political aspirations for a homeland. And so the birth of the State of Israel and the consequent destruction of the Palestinian people, the creation of a new diaspora, was largely driven by political expediency. Britain and France and the United States having a political agenda to have an influence in the Middle East, but also to further their commitment to Zionism.
Can we, as religious people, be it Muslim, Christian, Jewish, stand up against these forces?
Well, very much so. I think that more than ever it's important for Muslims, Christians and Jews to work together where we share common values and a common commitment to justice and peace. Sadly, within all three faith communities, there are those who have an exclusive agenda on the Middle East, who see no place for religious minorities. I can only really speak from my own faith community, from the Christian faith, and here the worship of the one true God is linked to very much to our ethical position or ethical values and how we treat others. And the emphasis, certainly in Jesus' teaching, is upon compassion and mercy and kindness and love toward those who are vulnerable, the poor, widows, orphans, the marginalized, the refugee, and even to one's enemies. That the way to overcome misunderstanding and reduce tension and, God willing, remove conflict is through empathizing with others and through reaching out to build bridges, to build authentic relationships based on mutual recognition, mutual trust, mutual acknowledgement, rather than I'm superior to you. I will have a relationship with you as long as you meet my needs, or you let me steal your land, or you sell me your raw materials cheaply. That, the notion of colonialism has caused so much damage in the Middle East. And so it's very important that we stand with each other and build a world where we can live peacefully together.
But even with their own religion itself, like with Christianity, with Islam, there are many sects that don't actually get along themselves together. Do you think other religions would be successful in doing so?
Well, leaders lead, and leaders have to lead their people in a way that will engender respect and trust, and will honour their faith tradition. And as an individual, when I see our political leaders or our religious leaders acting in a way that is like Jesus, that's following in his steps, it inspires me to follow as well. Where I see political leaders care more about their own security or their egos or their vested self-interest, or caring more for their family than they do their constituency, then I become cynical, and I'm either tempted to copy them, if they can get away with it, why can't I? Or I'm disinclined to follow them. So we need to pray for our leaders, and we need to respect our leaders, but we need to hold them accountable too. And the best way to do that is to show them how we're living out our faith. And so, again, as a Christian, I can simply say that as I reach out to my Muslim friends and my Jewish friends who genuinely want to see a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, inclusive society where we treat one another equally and respectfully, that's a challenge to the people who have an exclusive agenda, but it is an example to my own community. I'm a leader of a church, and if my congregation sees me building bridges with my Jewish neighbours or my Muslim neighbours, they are more inclined to do the same with their neighbours.
That is true in that sense. But however, we've also got that every religion really has the similar message of peace and being good to your neighbour, and as you said also, like respecting one another and everything else. However, we may have seen that happen in the past in the Middle East, but it's not actually taking place.
No, and that's why we need to, in a sense, name the elephant in the room. We need to be honest and direct, not in an accusative way or a judgmental way or a superior way, but we need to acknowledge that colonialism, imperialism, the isms, if you like, that preference one racial group over another, or one religion over another, or one gender over another, male over female or whatever, is detrimental to our well-being as a community. And so specifically in relation to the Middle East, I have spent some of my life researching and speaking out against the role Christians have played in the past, confusing a political agenda with a religious agenda. They've equated their faith with Zionism, or they've equated their faith with a political agenda which created the State of Israel, which created 700,000 refugees, the Palestinian refugees who lost their homes, that lamentably today justifies ethnic cleansing, justifies apartheid, justifies the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and their land. We've got to speak out and say this is immoral, this is evil, this is antithetical to our faith as Christians. And we shouldn't be surprised when Muslims and Jews are turned off from the teachings of Jesus when they see so-called Christians acting in the way that they do.
Speaking of Christians acting that way, we've also got the so-called Muslims, which is ISIS in Iraq, which is, they believe that they're actually going in the lines of Islam, whereas they're going against what Islam stands for. But this is what's happening in the Middle East. You would have, Israel, it's more of a state versus state conflict, but in Iraq or in Egypt, they've got it more as religion versus religion. How can that be solved?
Well, I would want to be very careful as a Christian leader making authoritative comments or criticisms of those who are Muslims or those who are Jews, in case my comments were misconstrued as a generic criticism of Islam or Judaism. Which is why, if I'm asked to speak about ISIS, for example, or the Islamic State, I would rely on other Islamic sources or Islamic scholars to help explain to me why what they are doing is the opposite of what Islam teaches. So, I would want to emphasize the spiritual nature of our faith and its outworking ethically in how we treat the poor, the marginalized, the refugees, the way we show the compassionate heart of God. I want to emphasize that we leave the judgment to God himself, that that we need to uphold the rule of law and apply that law to everyone, irrespective of their race or their religion, and not preference one against another. So I would want to uphold and support the government, the legitimate elected government in Iraq or in Syria, and challenge those who are seeking to destabilize that society by identifying with one sect or one religious group. What ISIS is doing is the denial of Islam very clearly, in the same way that Christian Zionists are denying the basic teaching of Jesus. But in terms of making critical comments, I would rather get my own house in order. Jesus said, before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, take the plank out of your own eye. And I think that as Christians, we need to take the plank out of our own eye before we try and remove the speck from the eye of our Muslim brothers and sisters.
With the Christian Zionists, did they kind of go wrong in the sense of they were more political than spiritual, do you think?
Yes, but also what they are doing is emphasizing the political nature of Judaism in the Hebrew scriptures. If we look at the story of God's redemptive plan through Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Joseph and Abraham and so on, God's revelation was focused on Jerusalem and upon the temple as the place of meeting. And what Christian Zionists do is emphasize the geographical location of Israel, Jerusalem and the temple, and they argue that God gave the land to the Jewish people, therefore it's theirs forever. They emphasize that the Jews remain God's chosen people, and they ignore what the prophets say. The prophets of the Hebrew scriptures emphasize the ethical nature of chosenness, the ethical nature of the behavior God expects of us. And when we read the prophets, what we find them saying is that you can stay in the land as long as you obey me. When you rebel against me, I will throw you out of the land. And that's precisely what happened. The tribes of Israel were expelled from the land to Babylon, to Assyria, and only a remnant were allowed back under Ezra and Nehemiah, about 400 years before the coming of Jesus. But they were only allowed back when they were sorry, when they acknowledged their sin. So the prophets emphasize, obey and you can stay in my land, rebel and you're out of my land. So the idea that the Jews have returned to the land in 1948 or 1967, in some sense because God has willed that to happen, it contradicts what the Bible actually says. They've come back through the use of might and power, and they're ignoring God. They're ignoring God's instructions about how they should treat the Palestinians.
You mentioned that the Christians are going with the Jewish scripture, and that the Jewish, they're kind of like the first religion. How come they're Christian then?
Well, the Christian faith was birthed in Judaism, in the same way that Muhammad prayed toward Jerusalem before moving to Mecca. There's much that we have in common in terms of our historical roots, and Christians are taught to read the Hebrew scriptures and to learn from them. They are historical, but they also reveal much about Jesus, about his birth, about his life, his teaching, and his death. They speak of those events, and therefore the Christian faith, in a sense, is rooted in the Hebrew scriptures. But the emphasis in the Hebrew scriptures, which Zionists ignore, is that the worship of the one true God was to be shared with all nations. All nations were to be taught to worship the true God, the one true God, and to repudiate polytheism and paganism and superstition. And they were taught a very high ethical code of love and mercy and kindness, specifically to the foreigner, to the refugee, to the poor, to the orphan, to the widow. And so that inclusive nature of God's people is worked out through the church. The prophet Isaiah emphasizes that God's house, the place of meeting, if you like, was to be a house of prayer for all nations. And when Jesus came and rebuked the religious leaders of his day, it was because they had thrown out the foreigners and they thought that only they were chosen, that the land was only for the Jews. So the inclusive nature, the desire to welcome other nations into God's people, and that we can worship him together, is central to the Christian faith, but it's actually there in the Hebrew faith too, but it's denied within Zionism.
We're all interlinked, like as you said, this Judaism first, Christianity, and then Islam came along. So why can't we actually, have the dialogue and put the conflict aside?
Well, that is our aspiration, and in my daily life, most people I meet warm to that aspiration and actually do engage in it. I think that it's sad that so often in our community here in the UK, we tend to live within our own community. There are parts of London that are predominantly Spanish or Italian or Australian or Iraqi or whatever. And yes, there is security in our own community, but there is strength in building bridges between the communities. And so I certainly work at that. And that's why I'm involved in making TV programs with Arab news channels, because I want to build bridges between our faith communities. It's just lamentable that the media seems to be preoccupied with the bad news stories, if you like, from those who use violence and exploit our inclusive nature to further their own agendas. And we've got to stand together and say, no, these are not authentic followers of Jesus. These are not authentic Muslims based on their behavior.
Many times, like with the situation that happened in Gaza, many people went to the BBC because, of course, the BBC wasn't covering the true events that were taking place. The Jewish, the Christian, the Muslim, all went protesting to BBC against what's actually happening. There wasn't any change. No,
and that's because you're dealing with the push-pull. You're dealing with the influence of the Zionist lobby in the UK is very strong. I'm writing a book at the moment on the Zionist lobby in the UK, and the reality is that the majority of the complaints the BBC gets for its coverage comes from Zionists. We may complain that the BBC is biased, against the Palestinian narrative. Zionists complain that the BBC is attacking Israel. We have got to be more proactive in using the influence we have in civil society to get our voice heard. But in the media, in the newspapers, and in the TV channels, the Zionist lobby is the one that dominates the agenda, gets their voice heard. In Parliament, 70% of Conservative and Labour Party MPs are members of the Conservative Friends of Israel, the Labour Friends of Israel. Virtually all of the cabinet, the senior politicians in the government are Friends of Israel. The Zionist lobby has an inordinate influence over our politicians in the media, and it's not anti-Semitic to say that, it's just the facts of life. And we've allowed it to happen. There are more Muslims in Britain. Well, there are more Muslims in Britain than Jews. But you wouldn't think that from the way in which the coverage of our media portrays both communities.
As you were saying that that there are more Arabs than Jewish in the UK, why is that the media is against the Arabs more than the Jews? Not that I'm saying that they have to be against the Jews, but the situation in Palestine that took place, everybody knows, deep down they know that Israel was in the wrong. Why can't they just state that on TV? or in the media?
It's normally political suicide to do so. When politicians like Claire Short or Baroness Jenny Tong or George Galloway or others, David Ward for example, when they speak out and speak the truth about what's happening, this is genocide, this is a war crime in Gaza, or this is this should be reported to the International Court of Justice, they are frozen out. They are pressure is put upon them by the Zionist lobby through the political establishment to keep quiet or get out. There are very influential organisations in Britain, BICOM, B-I-C-O-M, the Community Security Trust, the Board of Jewish Deputies, the Council of Christians and Jews. There are numerous Zionist organisations that target journalists, target politicians, seek to influence them either through financial donations, through all expenses paid trips to Israel, access to Israeli politicians, leading academics who will give them interviews, give them sound bites that will enhance their own careers as journalists or politicians. The Zionist lobby is very well organized. It's very well organized. And by comparison, the Muslim public affairs committees, the Muslim organizations have much less access, much less influence within the media and within Parliament.
How can we as citizens, though, make the Zionist influence less in the UK?
One of the ways we're doing that is through BDS, boycotts, divestments and sanctions. If our politicians won't hold Israel accountable for its war crimes, if our politicians and media won't sanction Israel in order to pressure them to allow a Palestinian state, we can use the little influence we have to make a difference. You may remember when Barack Obama was elected in the United States, he largely funded his campaign with small donations, less than $100, from thousands and 10,000s of American citizens who believed in him, who wanted to see him succeed. And through BDS, through boycotts, divestment, and through sanctions, civil society is making a difference. So ordinary men and women, we have a choice over what products we buy. SodaStream, for example, is being frozen out of John Lewis, out of many of the mainstream retailers, because of the campaigns that show that SodaStream, as an Israeli company, is operating out of the settlements, out of the West Bank illegally, and we shouldn't therefore buy their products. Targeting G4S, for example, who run the prisons in Israel, targeting Veolia, because Veolia has had an influence in the light railway that links the settlements in East Jerusalem to downtown Jerusalem. Targeting organizations, Caterpillar, for example, and others that either operate in the West Bank or are facilitating the continued Zionist agenda. By targeting them, by refusing to buy their products, by instead buying products that are from Palestinian sources, is making a difference. Israel is having to respond to this. We're seeing trade unions, academic institutions, theatres refusing to deal with Israeli universities, Israeli theatre companies, Israeli sportsmen. And this is freezing Israel out of normalization. It wants to get away with the occupation, and they want to refuse a Palestinian state, but they want normal relationships with Europe and America and so on, and even the Arab states. You know, Israel exports dates to the Arab world in Ramadan. They do it by selling them in packages written in Arabic. So Arabs think they're buying Middle Eastern dates. They're from Israel. We need to look at the source, find out where it's coming from, and refuse to buy products that are Israeli.
But not all companies, like there are a few that you mentioned, nobody knows not everybody knows about them. Let's say, is there like a certain app or something?
There is.
Or a website that people can know
Well,
more?
there are the Islamic Human Rights Commission, IHRC, on their website they provide resources that identify companies, Western companies that are operating in the West Bank, who sell products to the Israelis, either to weapons or machinery, or that are assisting the occupation. The Friends of Al-Aqsa, they have a website, Friends of Al-Aqsa, and on their website they again list the products that we should avoid. The app that you can buy for your smartphone is called Boycott, Buycott, and it lists products that you should avoid because they're either made in the West Bank or they're Israeli sourced, that are facilitating the occupation. We made a difference in South Africa. We boycotted Barclays Bank, we boycotted South African goods, and it helped bring apartheid to an end. We can do the same in Israel, Palestine.
So it's mainly boycotting, so protests ain't as strong, you believe?
I think it's growing, and I think Israel is beginning to worry. G4S has agreed to pull out of its contract in running the Israeli prisons in 2015 because of the weekly protests outside the G4S offices in London. Caterpillar has started advertising for business. After a long time, they didn't bother because they had such a monopoly of the market. They're actually having to go out there and market themselves because they know they're losing their market share because of the disruption at Caterpillar annual general meetings. If you buy 2 or 3 shares in Caterpillar, it gives you a right to speak at their annual general meeting, and you can challenge them over the fact that their bulldozers are being used to demolish Palestinian homes. It's a war crime. And when companies realize that they are likely to be charged with complicity in war crimes, they think twice about where they sell their products.
But they still kind of are funding or funded by the Israeli state, the really big companies, that is.
I'm sure that there is some funding and incentivization, but it's largely driven by the American funding of Israel, America's loan guarantees, the assistance it gives with military hardware. The money has to be spent in America, so it's American companies that benefit from this. But those are the companies that we need to focus on, Intel, Caterpillar, and others like that, because they are assisting the occupation of Palestine.
Going back to interfaith, in the UK there are many groups that try to strive and have the interfaith dialogue to try and bring peace. How much more do we actually need for there to be that type of peace in the UK, and then we'll go on to the Middle East?
Well, I think that on a daily basis, weekly basis, we need to reach out to those in our communities that are from other countries, that are of other faiths, and get to know them, understand them, build relationships, and so that when the crisis occurs, we already have a relationship. When the English Defence League, EDL, or when one of the far-right groups or one of the Islamist groups commits an atrocity or uses violence to further their end, that's the moment when the contacts we already have will be of value. So, my relationships with Islamic leaders and with Jewish leaders and my participation in interfaith events furthers the understanding and trust. And then when the crisis occurs, that's when we make the phone calls. How can we help each other? And there have been occasions when Muslims have supported Christians in distress, and when Christians have supported Muslims who are going through difficult times. Those are very important ways in which we can demonstrate our solidarity with one another. When
Israel was attacking Palestine, many people from different religious backgrounds stood together and became more of a united, uprising, where everyone in the UK, many other countries as well, were protesting against the evil that was taking place. Can't that make a difference in the Middle East, bring a bit of peace towards?
Well, I'm sure it does. We often know when things go wrong. We don't always appreciate when things go right because we don't recognise them of going right. We may focus on the government picking up people coming back from Syria who may have served with one of the extreme groups there, and the media may focus on this as an infringement of their freedoms, their human rights. We don't know when the police may pick up someone who was about to commit a crime because it didn't happen. So, sometimes we don't always see the consequences of our behaviour. What matters is that we're being faithful to our traditions, our faith tradition, that we, as Christians, we're seeking to follow Jesus. And if we are, then we must trust that we are making a difference, that we are. And I'll give you one example. Quite soon after 9/11, I was in Leicester. Leicester has a large Muslim community. I went there to buy some of my books from my publisher. I was hungry. I said, can you recommend somewhere to buy some fish and chips? They said, oh, there's a shop down the road called Mr. Biggs. I said, oh, great. They said, oh, but, it's Muslim. I thought, too bad, I need some fish and chips. So I went in, there was no one else in the shop. It was after 9/11, it was close after 9/11. There was no one in the shop, he didn't have any ready. I said, I'd like some fish and chips. So he cooked it for me. When it's being cooked, you have to wait. And you were chatting, I asked him how he was doing, asked him about his family. And when it was cooked, he wrapped it, he placed it on the counter. I got my money out. He said, no, I won't take your money. He wanted to give me the fish and chips. I said, why? You don't know me? And he didn't really tell me why, but he just wanted me to give. And I knew it was important that I took it. And I thanked him. I was back in Leicester 2 weeks later on a Sunday preaching in a church on a story that Jesus told about the Good Samaritan. The story of where someone is beaten up and left half dead and people walk by on the other side, but along comes a stranger and he stops and he helps the guy and he helps him recover. And I told them the story of the fish and chips and Mr. Biggs, and I said, this man showed me kindness. He had no one else in the shop, but he wouldn't take my money. I want you to go and buy your fish and chips from him and bless him with business. And that was my way of showing I wanted to repay Mr. Biggs, retaliate if you like, but with kindness, not with mistrust. And God willing, if those people went to that shop and bought his products, he might be saying, why are you doing this? You're Christians. You see, it builds trust, it builds relationships. He'll be more inclined to be generous, they'll be more inclined to be generous. That's the way to build relationships, by stepping out of our comfort zone, out of our ring of confidence, and trust that God will bless us as we reach out to support others.
Do you think religious leaders can play a huge role in bringing more peace around the world?
Yes, I think religion and particularly the monotheistic faiths are vital in spreading peace and harmony in our world today. I think that the notion that the war is a consequence of religion is a misnomer. It's the abuse of religious tradition that has led to war. But more people have died in our world in the last 100 years through communism and fascism than were injured or killed as a result of religious fighting. When people use religion for a political end, that's blasphemy, that's heresy, and we need to speak out against that.
That is a situation. Many people actually do believe that religion is the source of the conflict. So they believe to bring peace in the Middle East and other places around the world, we have to go around religion and put religion to a side. What do you think about that? Well,
no, I don't agree. I believe that if we take our faith seriously, that we live in a world created by the one true God, that He is sovereign, He is all magnificent, He is all powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. He is here, He sees, He knows, and we are accountable, and one day we will stand before him and be held accountable for our actions. That's an incentive to do his will now and not wait for that day to find out.
What else can we do to help the Middle East to see peace?
Well, one of the first things I think is to be better informed. I use the social media primarily for my knowledge of the Middle East. I don't invariably read the mainstream newspapers. I use Facebook, Twitter, and I try and read Middle Eastern newspapers in English, or media from Lebanon, from Jordan, from Syria and so on, to keep me informed on a daily basis. And so I enjoy reading stuff that people put on my Facebook from the Middle East, and I stay in touch with individuals in Gaza, in Palestine, in other countries in the Middle East, to hear what's going on in their lives. And often we'll hear things quicker that way than we will on the 9 o'clock news on the BBC. So building relationships with individuals in the Middle East is very important. Keeping ourselves abreast with what's happening, but then not just shrugging our shoulders and saying we can't do anything. Write that letter to the BBC. Pass on the information we're finding out about what's happening, and use our vote, use our the choices we make with what we buy in the supermarkets to make a difference, because the little steps we make can make a difference.
But do you think that Israel would actually stop then doing what it's doing to Palestine?
Well, let's put it this way. If the United States President and the United States Congress was to uphold the rule of international law, and it said to the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Knesset, we care about you very much, we are not turning our back on you, but the only way for you to be secure as Jews, the only way that there will be a future in the Middle East, if we are to avoid nuclear war, if we are to avoid another Holocaust, the only way is for you to respect the rights of the Palestinians. And either two states, equal states, side by side, independent, sovereign, contiguous, or one state with equal rights, as Jews and Palestinians, equal rights. The only way we're going to get there is that we bring in Iran, we bring in Iraq to the negotiating table, that a solution in the Middle East must involve Saudi Arabia and Iran and Syria and Israel and Egypt. We need a win-win, not a win-lose. And therefore, we are going to turn off the tap, the money that we give you every year. We're going to slowly, slowly stop it. So over the next 4 years, we're going to cut our funding. And if Israel knew that the money was stopping, if Israel knew that that America would recognize a Palestinian state, that America and Europe would hold Israeli military officials accountable for war crimes in international law, they would stop their crimes. If you know that you can't get away with something anymore, you stop. As long as you think you can get away with it, you will. And so as long as America is funding Israel, as long as America vetoes criticisms of Israel in the UN, as long as America refuses to recognize a Palestinian state, Israel will carry on doing what it's doing. And so if we're looking for a solution in Iraq, we must involve Iran. If we're looking for a solution in Syria, we must involve President Assad and the Syrian government. You know, the idea of getting a coalition of Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt on board for attacks against ISIS by America and Europe in Iraq, we might get away with it in Iraq as long as the Iraqi government holds together and invites support from outside. But if we think we can go into Syria and attack ISIS against the wishes of the Syrian government, that's just a recipe for proliferation.
But with Palestine, how many times have they actually said about the two-state solution and about, everyone will have one state and everyone would be equal? But then they've said that many times, and when we look through history, the map is just getting smaller and smaller. Palestine is shrinking. So
I don't believe there is a possibility of a two-state solution. I've given up on the two-state solution. Israel is a bit like a child, a spoilt child. If you go and visit your grandmother, if she's alive, she spoils you, because grandmothers do that. And imagine the grandmother has a jar of sweets, and she brings the jar out and she says, have a sweet. And you put your hand in there and you grab 3 sweets. And you can't get your hand out of the jar because you've grabbed too many. You've got to let go of the sweets to get your hand out with 1 or 2. Israel wants 3 sweets. It wants to be a Jewish state, it wants to be a Zionist state, and it wants to be a democracy. And it wants all the land. It wants all the land, no Palestinian state. It wants the land, it wants to be a democracy and a Jewish state.
But how can it be a democracy if it wants all the state, all the land?
By depriving the Palestinians of their democratic rights. The only way it can carry on what it's doing now is through apartheid. So it must give up one of those 3. If it gives up the West Bank, withdraws the settlers, it can be a democracy within the 67 borders for Jews. Arab Israelis can live in Israel or they can go and live in Palestine. Settlers can either move to live in Israel or they can submit to a Palestinian government, but they'd have to live under a Palestinian government. That's the two-state solution. Will Israel give up the West Bank? No.
No.
So what's the alternative? Give up being a Jewish state. A one-state solution says give the Palestinians Israeli citizenship. The West Bank becomes part of Israel-Palestine. Everyone, Gazans, West Bankers, they're all citizens of one state alongside the Jews. What that's going to do? Well, the Knesset is going to change radically. It can no longer be a Zionist state.
Of course.
It would be like Britain. Britain is a state for all people who are born in Britain. But will Israel give up being a Jewish state? No. Well, if it won't give up the West Bank and it won't give up being a Jewish state, then we must say you're not a democracy. You're an apartheid state. And if it's an apartheid state, then we can't treat it as a Western democracy. It shouldn't be joining in democratic processes, or, it shouldn't have preferential trade agreements. It shouldn't be allowed to join in the Football Association, European football, and so on. It should be treated the way we treated South Africa, as a pariah state.
It's still being treated just like any other democratic states, and the UN isn't actually doing anything about it. That everyone's quiet.
Which is why we've got to point out that it's not a democracy. And I think that's what is changing in British society. When I was a young man, you said the word Palestinian and people thought terrorist. And when you said Jew, they thought Holocaust. They thought...
so they would sympathise straight away.
When you say those words today, increasingly, people in Britain who are much more aware of what's happening in Gaza, in Israel, in the occupied territories, that it's shifting. There's much, much more sympathy for Palestine and much, much more criticism of Zionism and the state of Israel today within British society. So it's shifting. The trade union movement is boycotting Israeli trade unions, boycotting Israeli goods, and that shift is occurring. So the churches, again, increasingly are boycotting, investing in Israeli products for that reason, or Western products that are used in Israel. So the shift is occurring. It's slow, we may be impatient, but I believe that it is working. But we have much more work to do.
With all the sanctions taking place and the boycotting, many articles like Starbucks, for example, start saying that it's not an Israeli, it's not funded by Israel and it's not even part of Israel. However, the owner, apparently he is giving millions and millions of money to the Zionist state. What would someone do in this situation?
Well, you just said that the claim is that it's not Israeli, but actually there is funding going towards the Zionist state. That's what needs to be made public, so people can make informed choices over what they buy and how they invest their money in banks and so on. So, yeah, greater education is the first level, and then motivating people to be proactive in making the right choices and decisions for their lives, for their families, as well as for their wider communities. And then thirdly, let's make a difference in Parliament. Let's make sure that we elect politicians who genuinely have the interests of Britain at heart, and not a rather narrow political agenda.
But this is the difficulty, because all politicians say, you know, that they want the best for the UK, and they want, you know, every citizen to develop and become the most strongest person. However, we then see all of the prices of universities going up, but they're still able to attack, you know, or go in to other countries and stuff. So what can we actually do? Because the majority, the main Parliament, the main people in Parliament, you said 70%, they're with Israel. So what can we actually do?
Well, make sure that when we are nominating and voting, we know which of the candidates standing is more closely aligned to where we're coming from. I mean, why do we not have more Muslim MPs? More MPs who represent the faith communities that you know, represent the Muslim community. Baroness Warsi, for example, she resigned from the government over the Gaza issue. You know, I admire her for taking that stand. She clearly was speaking out for Palestine within the government, and that was uncomfortable for some of our politicians to hear. Let's pray for more politicians like her. You know, but it's a 20-year process, because you have to start out distributing leaflets. You begin to give speaking on behalf of a political party, then you take on a role, and then you get nominated, and then you get elected, and then you get to Parliament. It's a long process, but we've got to engage with politics and not just resign and shrug our shoulders or wash our hands and say there's nothing we can do. We can do a lot. I'll just use one illustration. There was a man walking by the seaside, and he looked in the distance and he saw a man picking up starfish and throwing them into the water. And as he looked carefully, there were thousands of starfish that had been washed up onto the shore, and the man was picking them up one at a time and throwing them back into the water. And the man went up to him and said, "What are you doing?" He said, I'm throwing starfish into the sea. I want them to live." And the man said, "But there are thousands of starfish. You know, why bother? You know, what difference can you make?" He said, "Well, it matters to this one. It matters to this one. You know, we must stop thinking there's nothing we can do and focus on what we can do, because together, when we all do what we can do, we can make a big difference."
Hopefully we all make a difference, and thank you
Inshallah.
very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.